In 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered America. Except, not exactly. Modern culture is quick to correct the oft-repeated mistake from the last few centuries, to rightly point out that while Columbus did eventually reach the shores of the New World, he was not strictly the first European to have done so, with Vikings having preempted him by a few centuries. And that America can hardly be said to have been discovered. After all, it was a long inhabited land only discovered from the European perspective, and only by mistake. Americas only happened to be located on what 15th century European entrepreneurs envisioned as an alternative westward route to India. But before Columbus ever set out on his fateful journey, a number of peoples laid the claim to the discovery of the continent. Some are little more than myths, perpetuated for glory or more sinister purposes. Others are scientific theories, some more and some less proven and provable. But all have served to influence people, cultures, and science throughout time. So let's take a walk through the history of claims to the American discovery. Before discussing any of our more infamous claims, I do want to first re-examine Columbus. The Genoan explorer was never uncontroversial, but in the centuries following 1492, his voyage was widely recognized and celebrated as a European accomplishment and a triumph. There was little criticism or willingness to recontextualize the Columbian discovery from a non-European perspective. But recent decades have brought on a more critical view of Columbus, not as a venerated figure, an idol, a celebrity, but as a tyrant and harbinger of doom. There is no way around the fact that he directly set off the colonialism era and the countless atrocities which followed. There are very good reasons to redefine the image of Columbus, just as there were, as we will explore, very good reasons to rewrite his role as the first European discoverer of America, as we make advancements in archaeology, genetics, and historiography. We have good reasons to forget Columbus as a kind discoverer and a hero. But, and hear me out on this, we should not forget Columbus. History ought not to be forgotten. Apart from reimagining him, there has been a movement to replace Columbus, to sort of forget his name and legacy and instead focus only on study of colonialism. But Columbus, despite his tainted legacy, has a very real place in our books as a discoverer of America, even if not the first. Factually, with the knowledge we have now, we can say with confidence that Columbus was, in fact, not the first European to reach the shores of America. But this fact does not diminish his discovery entirely, because to his contemporaries, to the collective European awareness of the era, the Columbus discovery was the defining discovery of the New World. Even if refuted with modern science, it was the Italian and not the Vikings who made America a reality and not just a myth, whose actions directly set off the chain of events that led to Americas as we know them today. Between the Vikings and Columbus, there was a few hundred years of lost knowledge about the New World. There was no exchange of knowledge between the Vikings and Central European scholars, which would have propagated this knowledge. In the Americas, meantime, the native inhabitants lived their own history, obscured from the rest of the world following the Viking exodus, which now itself is mostly lost knowledge due to the effects of the Columbian exchange. So the next time you are inclined to pull out the "Columbus did not discover America" card in an online discussion, yes, you are technically correct. But history is not linear. History happens everywhere and everywhen at the same time. It's messy, it's complicated, and it has heroes turned villains. But as our understanding of past events changes, as it always does, with advancement of knowledge, remember that history in the past was also history. To the peoples of many centuries past, Columbus did indeed discover America, and it remained a fact which shaped culture and events we can't forget. So the Columbus claim, even if refuted, still very much belongs on this list. If you were taught in the past that Columbus was not the first European to discover Americas, you were probably taught about the Vikings. This is a claim worth investigating, as contrary to the stories told later in the video, it is the only claim we have irrefutable evidence for. This is Leon Meadows. Today, a group of unassuming structures, but what used to be a real Viking settlement. Some of it has been rebuilt according to modern interpretation of what they may have looked like in their day, and others we have only some traces remaining of. But this site is our only physical and, more importantly, nearly undisputed evidence of Viking presence in Americas in pre-Columbian time. What makes this evident is Nordic architecture, the materials used, and the time period during which the settlement was constructed, dating back to the turn of the 10th and 11th centuries. Leon Meadows is only one of the clues we have of Vikings' presence in America. Some minor items of trade with natives were uncovered, for example, but none other has the same verifiable Nordic heritage. Vikings began to migrate westward from Scandinavia as early as the 8th century, settling Iceland and even Greenland in the 9th century. Life in Iceland was evidently challenging, but life in Greenland was doubly so. Its sparse vegetation, lack of timber, and little fertile land posed significant difficulty for Vikings attempted to migrate further west as early as the 9th to 10th century. The man credited for being the Viking Columbus is Leif Erikson, identified by Viking sagas as the first explorer of Vinland, the Norse name for the legendary lands in the far west, said to offer untold riches. Today, however, it is widely accepted that the Vinland of legends actually existed and referred to what we now know as the eastern coast of North America. But what you likely didn't know from history books is that this story has its own discoverer before the discoverer. Though we today credit Eriksson, in the original sagas it is actually Bjarni Herjolfsson who sighted America first, even if Leif was the first to step on it. An explorer himself, Herjolfsson spotted land covered in trees when on his way from Iceland to Greenland after a storm blew him and his crew off course. He safely made it back to Greenland, eager to reunite with his father, and recounted his discovery, but was not met with the interest and enthusiasm of his peers one would expect. Following Viking exodus from their American settlements, including Leon Meadows, knowledge of their discovery has been lost to history, and Vinland remained a thing of legends. Historians have long speculated of potential trade between American natives and Vikings because of small items found among natives in various locations in Greenland and North America of potential European origin. Alleged occurrences of white skin or blue eyes among American natives were also used as potential proof for Viking interbreeding with natives, although largely debunked and unsupported by genetic or circumstantial evidence. But the discovery of this settlement in 1960 was the one bit of truth to confirm the long-standing rumors. The discovery not only corroborated historic Viking sagas, but provided ample historical evidence for archaeologists. And so, this single archaeological site served as the last nail in the coffin for the claim of Columbus as the first European in America. But what about even older claims, however? 2020 saw a rush of articles alleging a new claimant to the title of the discoverer of America, the Polynesians. This claim was supported by a new type of evidence, genetics. It has long been known that Polynesians reached both Hawaii and Rapa Nui in ancient times. However, evidence for their contact with continental Americas has not been unearthed until modern genetic sequencing techniques showed, in a large-scale study of 80 native Polynesians, traces of genetic code originating from peoples indigenous to today's Colombia. This evidence is hard to refute, as DNA sequencing of this type can accurately trace ancestry and identify common ancestors as origins of particular strands of genetic code. It is not the only theory behind this genetic overlap, however. Another theory put forth is that of Native American discovery of Polynesia, where a deeper ancestry originating from a group in Asia, which could have served as the origin of both the Polynesians and indigenous groups of the Americas. As of writing of this video, however, the claims from the study published in 2020 have not yet been decisively refuted, lending additional veracity to its claims. And it is not the only evidence supporting Polynesian American contact theory. For decades now, another item of Polynesian identity riled scientists' hopes for Polynesian contact with Americans, the humble sweet potato. The plant, which evidently originated from South America, has been present in the Polynesian diet for centuries, and remains of the crop have been found in Polynesian archaeological sites dating back hundreds of years prior to Columbus's landfall. Pending confirmation of these theories, this would place Polynesians as the earliest confirmed discoverers of Americas, millennia prior to Columbus and at least hundreds of years before Leif Erikson. And though admittedly genetic strands and sweet potatoes do not make for such heroic protagonists as daring explorers, they are nevertheless as integral to the American story as the feistiest sailor. If indeed Polynesians set foot in South America, then there undoubtedly was also a Polynesian Columbus, perhaps even one whose name and antics were preserved for centuries afterwards. But history is ultimately indifferent to the fleetingness of human memory after passing of cultures and languages. So for our purposes, the sweet potato may as well take the place of the intended hero. John Scolvus is my personal favorite on this list, and the origin of my obsession with the topic in the first place. See, Scolvus' name may be better known to fellow Poles as Jan Skolna. John has been a source of sizable controversy throughout the centuries, where his claim to American fame is among the least circumstantial and is more akin to a folk legend than a proper scientific theory, yet is also one of the most enduring and imaginative ones. John Scolvus, if that even was indeed his name, was a 15th century explorer in the employ of the Danish kingdom who supposedly made his discovery of the New World in 1476, a full 16 years prior to Columbus. The Danish crown was deeply invested in the exploration of the Northern Sea, due to a possibility being raised as early as the 14th century of a passage from China to Norway for trade purposes. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? For which end they dedicated voyages throughout the ensuing decades prior to the word of America's discovery spreading throughout Europe. Not much is known about Scolvus himself, as all primary sources chronicling Scolvus' voyage are lost to time. Scolvus managed still to be plucked out of history books, even if by what little is known about his existence. Various secondary sources from the 15th and 16th century allude to a potential voyage undertaken by the Danish crown. For example, a globe from 1536 by cartographer Frisius marks an area west of Greenland as having been reached by Scolvus, identified there as a Dane. In various other sources from the era, Scolvus appears as a navigator of a journey which may have included famous Portuguese and German explorers and privateers. However, these chronicles rarely agree on the participants in the journey, the time it was undertaken, and exactly what was discovered. It appears that it was these multiple secondary sources that were used by a 19th century German historian, Kunstmann, who in a work on Discovery of America in 1859 identified Scolvus as the potential discoverer of Labrador. Whether Scolvus actually discovered America is dubious. With no contemporary source on the journey, what is left behind are chronicles of historians, cartographers, and propagandists who interpret the many conflicting accounts of the Scolvus journey and often speculate more so than report on. Historians, even if not unanimous, are most commonly of the opinion that such an expedition did exist. To quote Scandinavian Studies and Notes, there can be no doubt that an expedition actually did sail from Denmark-Norway into American waters about 20 years before the journey of Columbus, thoroughly before 1481, perhaps as early as 1472 or 1473. Whether Scolvus is the original Columbus or not is an issue of as much debate as any details of his biography. Earliest sources appear to be split between Scolvus being a Dane or Norwegian, and some German historians made a habit of claiming him to be a German. Only in 1841, the Polish historian Joachim Lelevel became the first to make the leap to identifying him as a Pole. Lelevel, calling upon texts by Dane George Horn and Dutch geographer Cornelius Whitfield, which both identified the pilot of the voyage as Johannes Scolnus Polonus, made the case that the word Polonus positively identified him as a Pole, and attempts to disprove alternative explanations with mixed results. It's natural to recognize Lelevel to be at least a little bit biased in his findings. He claims that Scolvus, whose name in the annals of history appears spelled at least 14 different ways, was actually called Jan, and hypothesized that his last name to be either Szkolny, related to school, or Skolna, Kolno being the name of a small town located in modern northeastern Poland. Will we ever know for sure if John Scolvus navigated to Labrador and thus became the Polish/Danish/Norwegian explorer of America? More than likely, no. The original seafaring journals, being the primary sources of this story, are, nearly certainly, irreversibly lost to time, and even had he made landfall in Labrador, his voyage would almost certainly not leave behind any material proof. Similarly, his nationality or even existence at all will nearly certainly remain in the realm of myth and hearsay. But his mythical status did not stop generations of Poles, Germans, and Scandinavians from repurposing him for own nationalist purposes, and Scolvus remains to this day a figure occasionally brought up in discussions of the age of the exploration. With this one, we're skipping right past fringe theories and into the weird. Because the evidence for this one, believe it or not, hinges on traces of cocaine in dead people's hair. Henut Taui was not an explorer of America, nor has she ever been to Americas. We can say that with complete confidence because unlike our earlier candidates, she was not an explorer. She was a priestess. And today, she is a mummy. A mummy which, when thoroughly examined by researchers, revealed something unusual. Trace amounts of cocaine, hashish, and nicotine in her hair. German toxicologist Svetlana Balabanova, who made the discovery about Henut Taui and other mummies at the Munich Museum in 1992, used this to support a pretty wild theory, that Egypt at the time of Taui's life, around 11th to 10th century BCE, could have had a trade relationship with natives in the Americas. The reasoning? It was thought at the time that these substances could only be obtained from cocoa and tobacco plants, both of which were native to the Americas and most definitely did not arrive in Africa until well into the European settlement of the continent. This has proved untrue in the years since. Subsequent research showed that nicotine, for one, could be derived from plants such as winter cherry and celery? Wait, celery? Yep, celery contains not a tiny amount of nicotine. The more you know. And both plants were known to Egyptians of the era. Nicotine and other mind-altering substances were known to be in use by ancient Egyptians and theorized to be part of burial rites of the era. Additionally, the mere discovery of the substances on the mummy could also have been the result of contamination, with various researchers in the time since disputing and reconfirming this theory. Retesting also failed to prove the presence of cocaine or hashish, but did test positive for nicotine. Modern research is pretty unanimous on the unlikely American origin of the substances found in Henut Taui, and instead prefers the contamination theory or simply faulty research. Thus, Egyptian contact with Americans pre-Columbus has since been relegated to scientific fringe theory, but science has yet to conclusively prove the source of the substances found at Henut Taui, so until then, the theory lives on, however unlikely and improbable. Muhammad ibn Qutb was the predecessor of Mansa Musa, the ruler, or Mansa, of the Mali Empire, which you may know as the most famous ruler of the mighty African empire, and the candidate for the potentially wealthiest human to ever walk the earth. The ruler of such power and wealth, he recently resurfaced in public consciousness as a legendary figure. Mansa Muhammad was not quite as powerful or wealthy as his successor. In fact, in the history books, he has become quite a controversial figure, whose most tangible legacy has become his short reign, which started at the start of the 13th century and lasted no more than a few years, and, according to Musa, abdicated his duty to lead an expedition into the Atlantic Ocean and never returned. It was this manner in which the Mansa disappeared from history that has become a hook for theories of potential African exploration of Americas. Mansa Musa stayed in Cairo for a few months in 1324, where he gave a report of the Malian history and his ascent to power to a local emir. The emir left behind a chronicle of this, which included Musa's recollection of his coming to power in Mali. In this report, it is widely assumed that Musa effectively throws shade at Muhammad and the cowardly manner of his abandoning of the empire. Musa recollects that Muhammad believed strongly that lands can be discovered past the strong currents of the Atlantic and sent an expedition of 200 ships with explicit instructions not to return until they would reach ocean's end or provisions run out. When the captain of one of the ships returned to Mali, he claimed that his vessel was the only one not to follow into a strong river-like current from which no ship emerged, and instead returned home. Hearing of this, Mansa Muhammad rose an expedition even greater of 2,000 ships and departed with them, never to come back. In saying this, it is assumed that Musa is highlighting his predecessor's cowardice, but some scholars, especially African, proposed it instead to be an act of supreme bravery and belief in science and exploration. The possibility of such a voyage is explored fairly seriously by researchers, even though no material trace of it was ever uncovered. The details of the story are thought to be at least plausible, and the river-like current mentioned by Musa is identified by some researchers as the Canary Current, a real phenomenon in the Atlantic which propels ships westward, but could prevent passage back home, accounting for the ships never returning. Ultimately, the only source for this voyage, and Mansa Musa's ascent to power at all, is the single chronicle of an Egyptian emir, and thus is not considered scientifically sound. However, in assuming that Mansa Musa was truthful about the circumstances which led to his take in the throne, this opens the possibility, however slim, that such a voyage did indeed take place, some 2 centuries prior to Columbus, and that Mansa Muhammad did indeed reach America, but that his exploration was short-lived due to a lack of resources needed to establish a colony, and potential hostility from the natives. Once again, we will likely never know the truth behind the supposed voyage of Mansa Muhammad, but to this day, African scholars will occasionally invoke his heroic voyage and the uncertainty of the exploration of the Americas as an example of African pioneering science and exploration. The theory of Phoenician discovery of America is one that cannot be understood in a void. Before we set out to explore it, we need to talk about the Book of Mormon. In the 1830s, an American, Joseph Smith, created, allegedly with divine intervention, a book upon the basis of supposed gold plates he found in New York State after the angel Moroni appeared in a vision to him, revealing their location. According to Mormon tradition, the plates were a chronicle of a group of Semites from Jerusalem over a few centuries, starting at around 600 BC, who, at the time of the fall of Jerusalem to Babylonians, fled their lands, led by God, eventually venturing to a promised land on a ship. As you may have guessed, this promised land is believed to be America, and the authors of the gold plates, transcribed by Smith, Moroni, and Mormon, are angelic descendants of these Semitic peoples who survived the voyage and who later became either the origin or interbred with the Native Americans. This account of the Book of Mormon is a massive oversimplification, and its details are subject to many internal schisms and are not universally accepted by all adherents. But how does all this tie in with Phoenicians? Phoenicians were another Semitic peoples inhabiting the Near East, most primarily the lands of what is now Lebanon. A famously seafaring civilization, the Phoenicians had mastery over the Mediterranean throughout their days, and even ventured far beyond the region, with modern science favoring the view that they have discovered Britain and traded in tin and other goods. It wouldn't then be a massive stretch of the imagination that they could have discovered America as well. A number of scholars have entertained the idea, especially in a time when the origin of Native Americans was still somewhat of a mystery. The discovery of artifacts in Americas, such as the petroglyphs at Dighton Rock, which depicted a language showing similarity to cuneiform or hieroglyphs, further fueled imaginations of the peoples of the era, for whom Phoenician origin of the natives was the matter of convenient coincidences, such as the existence of Aztec pyramids, a form previously only known from the Near and Middle East. No scientific proof has decisively shown to support the theory of Phoenician contact with Americas. The Dighton Rock could be a hoax or have another continental origin. We now have fairly unanimous consensus on the origin of Native Americans and their pyramids, among others. And though no proof has ever been found to support the theory, attempts to prove the possibility of such a voyage were undertaken. In 2019, a historic replica of Phoenician sailing ship set out from Carthage to successfully reach the Caribbean, which provided much needed confirmation that Phoenicians indeed possessed the seafaring technology to traverse the Atlantic. And just coincidentally, this replica ship was acquired by the Latter-day Saints Church of the Mormons shortly thereafter. I wonder why they would do that. Obviously, the Scripture of the Mormons is not considered an accurate historical account, and even within the church there is much discussion on just how much of the Mormon account is historical, and how much is little more than theological symbolism, and how much of the word of Joseph Smith is divinely inspired after all. But for the Mormons, the Phoenician discovery of America would be a very convenient affirmation of faith and serve as a confirmation for much of the theology of the church. Much can be said about the LDS Church and its practices, which I overlooked here for brevity. But regardless of your stance on this religious movement, one must understand that the Phoenician theory of American discovery does not exist without hefty baggage. The Welsh too have their American discovery story, one which involves only slight historical revisionism and ulterior motives. Madoc is part of medieval British mythology, possibly first recorded by a Flemish author in the 13th century. According to this account of the legend, in 1170, Madoc, son of Owain, a Welsh king, led an expedition which discovered abandoned lands across the Atlantic. Though the lands are never identified in the legend, it is a common assertion that these lands were America. Some versions of the legend stop short of providing the fate of the land post-discovery by Madoc. But according to Quinn Williams, a Welsh historian, some versions include Madoc establishing a colony on the island paradise he found, and even his peoples intermarrying with the land's native inhabitants. This story could have been acutely innocent if it wasn't for the British explorers of Americas post-Columbus. In the many centuries since it first emerged, the legend of Madoc was commonly used by the British Crown to lay claim to the American lands on the basis of its prior discovery by Welsh settlers. A common belief existed that among the native tribes was a tribe of Welsh-descended Indians, and that British would often attempt to locate these tribes. The claim of Welsh Indians and Madoc's presence in Americas persists in some ways to this day, in the names of many a place of interest in the Northern American Middle East, or the search for those supposed Welsh Indians. Needless to say, science never found any evidence for Madoc's discovery of America, and even his existence remains firmly in the land of legend. But even myth and legend can prove fertile sources for imperialist agenda. What to us may seem a cute legend, to others can be a story of mistaken identity, stolen land, and myth-fueled atrocity. Just keep that in mind. For every discovery someone makes, there will always be those who will attempt to lay claims of having preceded it, even without any substantial evidence. No less can be expected from the discovery, one of the most major human advancements in recorded history, and an event which has become itself a synonym of discovery. We have descended not even halfway down this monstrous iceberg of claims, and with enough research you may find that there are nearly as many claims to the discovery as there are cultures on Earth. I did not even mention the Chinese, Indian, or Roman claims, or countless others. Some of these claims, as science finds, may be more scientifically sound than others. Some are myths used simply to bolster nationalist identity and play into cultural achievement. Others have a more sinister side, being used directly to distort the truth to advance imperialist goals, and accelerate colonialism and exploitation. But America is a continent that needed not to be discovered. Before Columbus, before Vikings and Polynesians, a couple of thousand years ago, the first peoples entered the North American continent via Beringia, a land bridge between today's Asia and Americas. These peoples then spread out southward and eastward, eventually making the two continents their home. There, they existed for as much as 20 millennia, undisturbed, uncontacted, and physically isolated due to the sea claiming Beringia and turning it then into the Bering Sea. They, and not anyone else, were decisively the true discoverers of Americas. And it is only due to the Western perception that we sit here and discuss who discovered the continent. Ultimately, America needed not a discoverer, but once it found peoples willing to exploit it, it marked the doom for its natives. History is not linear, not uncontroversial, and not complete. Our perception of the history of the continent may yet change, and just perhaps some of the theories I outlined may still find confirmation. But the way we discuss the claims to America is the result of one particular narrative thread in the infinitely complex story of an infinitely complex continent. I have hopes that this video will serve to recontextualize these claims in a new light and to give the proper respect and recognition to the true discoverers of America, the true heroes of this story. As always, thank you for watching.